Chapter 5. Awaken the Dimensional Mind, the Creative Active. As you accumulate more skills and internalize the rules that govern your field, your mind will want to become more active, seeking the use of this knowledge in ways that are most suited to your inclinations. What will impede this natural creative dynamic from flourishing is not a lack of talent, but your attitude. Feeling anxious and insecure, you will tend to turn conservative with your knowledge, preferring to fit into the group and sticking to the procedures you have learned. Instead, you must force yourself in the opposite direction. As you emerge from your apprenticeship, you must become increasingly bold. Instead of feeling complacent about what you know, you must expand your knowledge to related fields, giving your mind fuel to make new associations with different ideas. You must experiment and look at problems from all possible angles. As your thinking grows more fluid, your mind will become increasingly dimensional, seeing more and more aspects of reality. In the end, you will turn against the very rules you will have internalized, shaping and reforming them to suit your spirit. Such originality will bring you to the heights of power. The second transformation. From the moment he was born, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was surrounded by music. His father, Leopold, was a violinist and a composer at the court of Salzburg, Austria, as well as a music instructor. All during the day, Wolfgang would hear Leopold and his students practicing in the house. In 1759, his 7-year-old sister, Maria Anna, began taking piano lessons from their father. She showed great promise and practiced at all hours. Wolfgang, enchanted by the simple melodies that she played, began to hum along the music. He would sometimes sit at the family's harpsichord and try to imitate what his sister had played. Leopold would soon detect something unusual in his son. For a 3-year-old, the child had a remarkable memory for melody and an impeccable sense of rhythm, and all without having had any instruction. Although he had never attempted to teach someone so young, Leopold decided to begin teaching piano to Wolfgang when he turned 4. And after only a few sessions, he realized the boy had other interesting qualities. Wolfgang listened more deeply than other students, his mind and body completely absorbed in music. With such intensity and focus, he learned more quickly than other children. Once, when he was 5 years old, he stole a rather complicated exercise meant for Maria Anna, and within 30 minutes he would play it with ease. He had heard Maria Anna practice the piece, and remembering it vividly the moment he saw the notes on the page, he could rapidly reproduce the music. This remarkable focus had its roots in something that Leopold saw almost from the beginning. The boy had an intense love for music itself. His eyes would light up with excitement the moment Leopold laid out a new challenge piece for him to conquer. If the piece was new and hard to figure out, he would attack it day and night with such tenacity that it would soon become a part of his repertoire. At night, his parents would have to force him to stop practicing and send him to bed. This love for practice only seemed to increase within the years. When it came time to play with other children, he would find a way to transform a simple game into something he involved music. His favorite game, however, had to take some piece he had been playing and improvise on it, giving it a personal flair that was quite charming and intensive. From his earliest years, Wolfgang was exceptionally emotional and sensitive. His moods would swing wildly. He would have petulant one moment, highly affectionate the next. He had a particularly anxious look on his face that would only disappear when he sat down at the piano. Then he was in his element, losing himself in the music. One day in 1762, Leopold Mozart learned his 2 children playing a piece for 2 pianos. An idea came to him. His daughter Maria Anna was a very talented piano player on her own right, and Wolfgang was a veritable marvel. Together they were like precious toys. They had a natural charisma, and Wolfgang had a showman's flair. As a mere court musician, Leopold's income was rather limited, but he could see the potential for making a fortune through his children. And so, 6 Thinking this through, he decided to take his family on a grand tour of the capitals of Europe, playing before royal courts and the public and charging money for the entertainment. To add to the spectacle, he dressed the children up. Maria Anna was as a princess and Wolfgang as a court minister, complete with a wig, elaborate waistcoat, and a sword dangling from his belt. They began in Vienna, where the children charmed at the Austrian emperor and empress. Then they spent months in Paris, where they played court, and Wolfgang bounced on the knee and delighted King Louis XV. They continued to London, where they ended up staying over a year, playing before all kinds of large crowds. And while the sight of the two children and in their costume Charles' audiences enough, Wolfgang's playing astounded them. He had developed numerous parlor tricks, stage managed by his father. He would play a minute on a keyboard that was hidden from his view by a cloth, using only one finger. He would deftly sight read the latest composition by a famous composer. He would play his own compositions. It was impressive to hear a sonata composed by a 7-year-old, no matter how simplest it was. Most marvelous of all, Wolfgang could play at an incredible speed, his tiny fingers flying over the keyboard. As the tour continued, an amusing pattern began to develop. The family would be invited to do some sightseeing tour on the countryside, or attend a soiree, while Wolfgang would find some excuse to stay behind. A frightened illness or complaints of exhaustion, he would devote his time instead to music. His favorite ploy in his vein was to attach himself to most illustrious composers in the particular court where they were visiting. In London, for instance, he managed to charm with the great composer John and Christian Bach, son of John and Sebastian Bach. When the family was invited out on a jaunt, he declined to join with the perfect excuse. He'd already engaged Bach to give him lessons in composition. The education he had received in this fashion from all the composers he met went far beyond anything any child could hope to receive. Although some argued that this was a waste of childhood for someone so young to be so single-minded, Wolfgang felt such an ardent love for music and the constant challenges it presented that in the end he derived much greater pleasure from his obsession than any amusement or game could provide. The tour was a great financial success, but it nearly ended in tragedy. In Holland in 1766, the family was beginning its return journey. Wolfgang felt ill with a powerful fever, losing weight rapidly. He drifted in and out of consciousness, and at one point appeared near death. But miraculously, the fever passed, and over the course of several months he slowly recovered. The experience, however, altered him. From the moment on, he had a constant feeling of melancholy and a foreboding that he would die young. The Mozart family had come now to depend on the money that the children had gathered through the tour, but as the years went by, innovations began to dry up. The novelty had worn off, and the children no longer seemed so young and precious. Desperate to generate money, Leopold came up with a different sheet. His son was turning into a very serious composer with the ability to compose in different genres. What he was needed was to secure him for a stable position as a court composer, to attract commissions for corrections and symphonies. With this goal in mind, in 1770, father-son embarked series on tours of Italy, then the center of all things musical in Europe. The trip went well. Wolfgang performed his magic on the piano before all the major courts in Italy. He gained acclaim for his symphonies and concert pieces. They were quite impressive for a teenager. He mingled yet again with the most celebrated composers of the time, intensifying the musical knowledge he had gained from the previous tours. In addition, he rediscovered his greatest passion in music, the opera. As a child, he had always had the feeling that he was destined to compose great operas. In Italy, he saw the finest productions and realized the source of his fascination. It was the drama translated into pure music, the nearly limitless potential of the human voice to express, the full range of emotion, and the overall spectacle. He He had almost primal attraction to any kind of theater, but despite all the attention and inspiration he received, after nearly 3 years of visiting the various courts in Italy, he was not offered a position or a commission that was worthy of his talents. And so, in 1773, father-son returned to Salzburg. After some delicate negotiation with the Archbishop of Salzburg, Leopold finally managed to secure for his son a relatively lucrative position as a court musician and a composer. By all appearances, the arrangement was good. Not having to worry about money, Wolfgang would have endless time to work on composing, but almost from the beginning, Wolfgang felt uncomfortable and restless. He spent almost half his youth traveling throughout Europe, mingling with the leading minds in music and listening to the most renowned orchestras, and now he was relegated to life in provincial Salzburg, isolated from the European centers of music in a city that had no theater or opera tradition. More troubling, however, was the mounting frustration he felt as a composer. For as long as he could remember, his head was continuously filled with music, but it was always the music of other people. He knew that his own pieces were simply clever imitation and adaptations of other composers. He had been like a young plant, passively absorbing nutrients from the environment from the form of different styles he had learned and mastered. But he could feel stirring from deep within something. The more active the desire was to express his own music and stop imitating. The soil was now rich enough. As an adolescent, he was assailed by all kinds of conflicting and powerful emotions: elation, depression, erotic desires. His great desire was to transpose those feelings into his work. Almost without being aware of it, he began to experiment. He wrote a series of slow movements for various string quatrains that were long and drawn out of the strange mixes of moods, full of anxiety that would rise to great crescendos. When he showed these pieces to his father, Leopold was horrified. Their income depended on Wolfgang supplying the court with the kind of pleasant melodies that would delight people and make them smile. If they or the Archbishop heard these new compositions, they would think Wolfgang had gone insane. Besides, the pieces were too complicated for the court musicians for Salzburg to perform. He begged his son to stop including in such strange music, or at least to wait until he had a position somewhere else. Wolfgang, acquitted at the time, he went on and grew increasingly depressed. The music he was being forced to write seemed to have hopelessly dead and conventional. He had no relation to what was going on inside him. He composed fewer pieces and performed less often. For the first time in his life, he was losing his love for music itself. Feeling imprisoned, he grew irritable. When he heard an operatic aria sung in public, he was reminded by the kind of music he could be composing, and he would go into a funk. He began quiver increasingly with his father, pressing from anger and begging for forgiveness for his disobedience. Slowly registered himself to his fate. He would die in Salzburg at an early age, without the world ever hearing the kind of music he knew excited within him. In 1781, Wolfgang was invited to accompany the Archbishop of Salzburg to Vienna, where he was planning to showcase the musical talents of his various court musicians. Suddenly, in Vienna, the nature of his status as a court musician became clear. The Archbishop offered him about as he were simply one of his personal staff, a mere servant. Now that all the resentment Wolfgang felt for the past 7 years bubbled and rose to the surface. He was 25 years old and losing valuable time. His father and the Archbishop were actively holding him back. He loved his father and depended on his family for emotional support, but he could tolerate the circumstances no longer. When it was time to return to Salzburg, he did the unthinkable. He refused to leave. He asked to be dismissed from his position. The Archbishop threatened him with the utmost contempt, but finally relented. His father sided with the Archbishop and ordered his son to return, promising that all would be forgiven. But Wolfgang had made his mind. He would stay in Vienna for what would turn out to be the rest of his life. The rift with his father was permanent and extremely painful, but sensing that his time was short and that he had almost too much to express, he threw himself into the music with an intensity that was given greater than what he had displayed in childhood. As if all of his ideas had been pent up for a long, he exploded in a creative outburst and unprecedented in history of music. The apprenticeship of his past 20 years had prepared him well for this moment. He developed a prodigious memory. In his mind, he could hold together all of the harmonies and melodies he had absorbed over the years. Instead of notes and chords, he would think of the terms of blocks of music and write them out as quickly as he heard them in his head. His speed of composing would now astonish those who witnessed it. For instance, the night before the premiere of Prague of the opera Don Giovanni, Mozart had gone out drinking. When his friends reminded him that he had not yet written his overture, he hurried home, and while his wife kept him awake by singing to him, he wrote one of his most popular and brilliantly convinced overtures in a matter of hours. More important, the years he had spent learning how to compose in everything convincible genre now allowed him to use these genres to express something new, stretch their boundaries, and even permanently transform them through his creative powers. Feeling turmoil within himself, he searched for a way to make music something powerful and expressive, and not merely evocative. In his time, the piano concerto and symphony had become rather light in frivolous genres, with short, simple movements in smaller orchestras and an overabundance of memory. Mozart completely reworked these forms from within. He wrote for larger orchestras, explaining in particular the violin sessions. Such orchestras could produce a more powerful sound than he had previously been known. He expanded the length of his symphonic movements well beyond convention. In his opening movement, he would establish a mood of tension and dissonance that he would proceed to build up in a slow second movement, and which he would resolve in a grand and dramatic resolution at the finale. He gave his compositions a power to express dread, sadness, foreboding, anger, exhilaration, and ecstasy. Audiences were spellbound to his new sweeping sound that suddenly had so many new dimensions. After these innovations, it became almost impossible for composers to return to the light, fourth chord music that had previously prevailed. European music had forever been altered. These innovations did not spring from any conscious desire of his part to provoke or rebel. Rather, his transforming spirit emerged as if it were completely natural and beyond his control. Like a bee secreting wax, aided by his superior sense of music, he simply could not help but personalize every genre he worked on. In 1786, he came upon a version of Don Juan legend that excited him. He immediately identified with the story of the greatest seducer. He shared Don Juan's obsessive need for love for women, and he had the same disdain for authority figures. But more important, Mozart felt as the composer, he had the supreme ability to seduce audiences, and that music itself represented the ultimate seduction, with its irresistible power to strike at our emotions. Translating the story into an opera, he would convey all these ideas. And so the following year began early work at his opera Don Giovanni, Italian for Don Juan, to make his story come alive in the way he had imagined it. He would once again apply his transformative powers, this time for the genre of opera. At the time, operas tended to be rather static and formulaic. They consisted of recitals, spoken dialogue accompanied by harpsichord that conveyed the story in action, arias, sung portions in which the singer would react to the information in the recitative, and choral pieces, featuring large groups of people singing together. For his opera, Mozart created something that had flown as a conscious whole. He conveyed the character of Don Giovanni, not just through the words, but through the music accompanying the seducers present on the stage, with a constant twitching tremolo in the violins to represent his nervous, sensual energy. He gave the work an accelerated, almost frantic pace that no one had ever witnessed before in the theater. To push the expressive of the music further, he invented and stables, stirring climatic moments in which several characters would sing, sometimes over one another, in an elaborate counterpoint, giving the opera a dreamlike feel and glow. From beginning to the end, Don Giovanni resorted with the demonic presence of his of the great seducer, although all the other characters condemned him. It was impossible to not admire Don Giovanni, even as he remains unpleasant to the end, laughing all the way to hell and refusing to submit to authority. Don Giovanni was not like any opera anybody had ever seen before, either in the story or in the music, and it was perhaps far too ahead of its time. Many complained that it was rather ugly to harsh to the ears, and they found the pace too frantic of the mortal ambiguity too disturbing. Continuing to work at deliriously creative pace, Mozart exhausted himself and died in 1791, 2 months after premiering his last opera, The Magic Flute, at the age of 35. Several years after his death, the audiences caught up with the radical sound he had created in the works such as Don Giovanni, which soon became among the 5 most frequently performed operas in history.